second system that I want to talk about, which is command input. So before I get too far into this, I just want to preface by saying that I could talk about controls all day. I love geeking out about controls. I think that really tight controls are hard to do well, and a lot of my favorite games, unanimously have tight controls in them. But as we look at Diablo 3, we knew that we were going to have 6 skills available to you on the hotbar. And this seemed pretty straightforward at first. You can see in the shot, some skills are bound to 1, 2, 3, 4, left mouse button and right mouse button. But we immediately started to run into some problems during development. And this was this idea of lost clicks. And this plagued us during large parts of internal development. Because players play Diablo 3 very frenetically. You're constantly clicking, you're constantly issuing commands to the game, and a lot of times you're entering multiple keystrokes as well as mouse commands all at once. But your character has to animate, and animation is a very key part of making you feel connected to your character. I issue a command, the command is received by the game, my character performs an animation, and then I get the result. So how do we handle the input when the player is telling us lots of things at once? Before we go into that problem too much, let's go over the animation structure. So all of our combat animations involve, an animation usually between 18 and 28 frames long, which have 3 important points: the start frame, the contact frame, and the end frame. The start frame is our way of letting the user know that your command has been received and we're now going to perform the power. One of the things I want to call out about the start frame is it is an extreme pose. If you look at the barbarian and the full sequence of the animation that he's going to go through, it's the strongest silhouette, And it's because when the player clicks that button and the animation begins, normally in a lot of classical animation, you have what's called anticipation at the beginning of the animation. An analogy would be in console platformers. Game industry figured out pretty fast that you don't want your character to bend his knees, and wind up a jump, because it just doesn't feel responsive to have that delay before my character actually starts traveling through the air. Well, we found the same thing for Diablo 3, is for the controls to feel really responsive, we skip and cut out huge parts of the anticipation, go straight to an extreme silhouette, strong silhouette extreme pose, so that you get that immediate feedback. User, we got your command and we're performing the power. And that's what increases that sense of control. So from the start frame, you then begin animating through to the contact frame, which is always located for us between 1/4 and 1/3 way into the animation. We tried other positions, and we really felt like that was the best compromise between giving the weapon some weight versus feeling like you got your impact out. The contact frame is when, if I'm a melee attack, I actually make contact with the enemy and hit. It's if I'm a ranged attack, that's when the projectile actually comes out. If I'm a caster, that's when the buff goes off. And then that time from the contact through to the end, that's the follow-through. That's where the animators have time to communicate a lot of weight in the weapon. That's where your attack speed really comes into play if you have a slow versus fast weapon. And all of that happens from the contact through to the end. As a side note, that's also when we then allow the player to move, which is another iteration that we did, which I don't go into too much detail on, but we found that players really enjoyed that ability to stutter step their animations through, so we allow movement after the contact frame. So let's get back to the original problem. The player now has the ability to issue up to 6 commands all at once. 1, 2, 3, 4, left mouse button, right mouse button. So for the purposes of illustration today, I'm going to focus on 4 skills that I'm going to use as examples: Magic Missile, Arcane Orb, Blizzard, and Ice Armor. So that first skill, like I said, is Magic Missile. Here's a video of what that looks like. Magic Missile is a single target skill, shoots a fairly fast projectile, hits one enemy, and has no resource cost. This skill is Arcane Orb. It shoots a slower projectile that does area of effect damage and has a high resource cost. So you can kind of see there's different reasons why, as a player, I might want to cast one versus the other. The third skill is Blizzard. I go through my animation. Upon hitting the contact frame, ice begins to fall from the sky, and then my character is free to do other things after that contact frame, and ice will continue to fall from the sky for a couple seconds and do damage to an area. And the last skill is Ice Armor. This one's a buff. I go through my animation. I cast a buff on myself. That buff is represented by that large shell of ice that you see forming around the wizard. That's in response to me casting Ice Armor. While I have that buff on me, if a monster swings at me, it's frozen. There's a great feeling of power as a player when a monster walks up and is just frozen in its tracks like that, and you're not even doing anything. You didn't even have to do an animation once the buff is on you. So let's get to this problem, back to the problem of lost clicks. First thing we did is we divided all of our powers into primary animation powers and secondary animation powers. And that distinction was pretty quick to make. The idea here is a primary animation power really wants to play its animation. In fact, if you can't play your animation, then the power is going to fail. This really tied into anything that's going to do damage in particular, like your normal attacks, your swings, your magic missiles and stuff. Because if I don't animate and a projectile still comes out, then that's going to feel really weird. It's going to feel like, I'm not going to feel as connected and the combat's not going to feel as visceral. So the animation is really important. A secondary animation power, on the other hand, is one where we felt like, you know what? If we can't play the animation, that's kind of OK. We can still have the power go off. So we tied some very loud, strong visual effects to all of our secondary animation powers so that even if you were currently animating something else, we could have the power go off, the particle effects go off to communicate that we've received your command and executed on it, but we don't interrupt what you're currently doing. And we also don't allow the power to fail. Here's what that looks like. So of the 4 skills, Ice Armor is a secondary animation power, because it's a buff, and we're OK if you don't animate. So here, I'm running around, and every time that blue shell goes off, I'm casting Ice Armor. So you can kind of see that we still let the player run around and cast Ice Armor. I could even be attacking while I'm casting Ice Armor. Here I am casting some magic missiles, and Ice Armor goes off every time the player clicks the spell. So the result of that, again, very good. We consider that experiment a success. Improves controls for the player. And some people would argue that there is a slight increase in power for the players because, hey, before I had to kind of stop moving to cast Ice Armor. And isn't that part of the gameplay of keeping up a 2-minute buff? Is that opportunity cost of standing still? And our ultimate conclusion was that the feeling of these lost clicks and really feeling in control of your character was more important than tying in that animation and that slight increase in power that we were giving to the players. So while this was good and it improved the number of reports of lost clicks that we were getting, it still doesn't address all the skills that do need to animate, and that was the other 3. So we took a look at those. The first thing we tried is interrupting powers. The idea here is if I issue a whole bunch of commands, just perform the last command that was executed by the user. This kind of makes sense at an intuitive level, because if I'm pushing a whole bunch of buttons, there's probably a skill right at the end that I pressed. If I cast like Magic Missile, Arcane Orb, and then bam, I'm hammering on Blizzard, I kind of really expect Blizzard to come out. So why don't you just stop what you're doing and do that power instead? And here's what that would look like in action. So this video is slowed down by down to a third at 33% speed, so you can kind of see the interruption and process. So these are just some reference shots, Magic Missile and Arcane Orb. So here's Arcane Orb as it goes out. But now watch as Magic Missile and Arcane Orb are allowed to interrupt each other. As Magic Missile is finishing up, between the contact frame and the end frame, before it's completely finished, the user issues the next command, and we just immediately respond. We cut off the rest of the animation and begin the new power. And here's Arcane Orb being interrupted by Magic Missile. The result is improved controls. That's kind of to be expected. If I push a button, that skill is guaranteed to go off. So we really like that aspect, and it was showing a lot of promise. The downside is, as some of you may have guessed, it does result in the opportunity for some increased DPS on the player, which of course we always have to evaluate how much increased power are we giving versus the sense of control. It was kind of negative in this case because it also created what I call a burden of optimal play. This is the idea that the player can increase their power level, but they do so in a way that's not necessarily enjoyable. I mean, although I can get extra frames of animations trimmed off of my skill to do more damage, I have to stare at my character really carefully and carefully time and take latency into account and all these other factors that didn't seem very appealing. But more importantly, I could also still lose some commands if the command was issued before the contact frame. So let's take a look at what those two problems look like. So here's an example of how a player could increase their DPS. And you can kind of see by weaving arcane orbs and magic missile back and forth, I can actually cut off all the time from the contact frame through to the end frame and get almost twice as many projectiles out as I could before. Remember, though, this is at 33% playback speed, so you can kind of imagine what this must be like to play at full speed. That's the burden of optimal play. But the bigger problem was this problem. If I clicked before the contact frame, I didn't get my projectile. You can kind of see the wizard's interrupting herself, so nothing comes out. And this was a huge problem. And we were like, we can't ship like this. Like, I'm spamming magic missile and arcane orb and nothing is coming out? So we knew we had to try something else. So the next idea we tried is this idea of a command queue. And this is actually pretty common in a lot of games, both MMOs, action RPGs in general, is that you queue a lot of commands. And we were a little bit apprehensive about this for two reasons. The first reason is that at a point in time, we were already in beta. We had tried the interrupting method that I just mentioned, had actually gone out to the public during the beta test. And and a lot of players had picked up on this like optimal DPS problem, and we were in complete feature lockdown because we were trying to hit a ship date, and there has to be that time where you're just polishing all the systems you have and you're wrapping it up and you want to get the game out the door. But the team believes in tight controls. So when we sat down and we really evaluated how big of a deal we thought this was, at Blizzard we have one of our design values, control is king. And we had a discussion, and we said, you know what? Even if we have to delay the game, the controls must feel tight and responsive. We knew this to be the case because although a lot of other features could probably be cut or delayed or worked on later or pushed out, controls, it was unacceptable that we would go out with anything less than really tight controls. So that was our first concern. The second concern is that we had seen other games do command queuing, and sometimes it actually results in controls that feel worse. A lot of times when we had played some other action RPGs, your character ends up queuing a bunch of commands, and it actually feels like there's a loss of control. To use an extreme example, if you did full queuing, imagine I cast like 5 magic missiles in a row by clicking really, really fast. I mean, I certainly wouldn't expect to be able to take my hands off the keyboard and my character still shoots 5 magic missiles out. I mean, that'd be ridiculous. You definitely feel like you actually had less control of your character at that point. So what we did is some queue windows. And those queue windows are very carefully tuned and have some rules surrounding them. The first rule is never queue more than 1 command at a time. This one almost seems obvious. This is the rule that most games implement pretty early on when you implement command queuing. So even if I click Magic Missile 5 times in a row, I'm going to queue the one that I'm currently doing, and I'll queue 1 more, and that's it. The second rule we have is that we only queue commands for a very brief time window. We tried different time windows from 0.1 seconds up to 1.0 seconds, and we really found that there's a sweet spot between 0.3 and 0.5 seconds is the amount of time that we feel like you want to hold on to that command and queue it. If you think about it from a qualitative standpoint, what you're really saying with your queue window is, how long ago could the player have asked the character to do something that when it comes out, you're not kind of surprised? And that feels like about 0.3 to 0.5 seconds, where you're like, yeah, I kind of cast Blizzard. I just did that. It should come out. That feels right. So all of our powers are set up with values between 0.3 and 0.45 seconds for the amount of time that they're allowed to queue. The last thing we had to do is what we have happen when the player actually does more than 2 commands, because we've already established we're not going to queue more than 1 command in advance. So what happens when multiple extra commands are issued? So how do you handle that? Well, the first rule, and I'll kind of give you some examples, if one is currently executing, the different command has priority. So to illustrate what that means, imagine again that I'm casting Magic Missile a lot. Missile, 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 missile. And then I insert an Arcane Orb command in the middle of that. Missile, missile, Arcane Orb, missile, missile, missile. And that's happening all the time in our game because players are spamming the left mouse button as fast as they can, and then they issue one of the other commands that they have. That command, because it was different than what's currently being done, is super important. The player expects that different command to happen, so it gets high priority in the queue and cannot be knocked off by any other future commands of Magic Missile until that Arcane Orb comes out. That's rule number one. The other rule for handling two commands is if both of them are different than the currently executing command, then do the latest one. So again, use my Magic Missile example earlier. Missile, 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 Arcane Orb. Now the Arcane Orb is queued and it's locked in. Missile, 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 Blizzard. Well, which one do I do now, the Blizzard or the Arcane Orb? Because they're both different than the currently executing Magic Missile. In that case, you want to do the latest one. And that was sort of a lesson that we had picked up from that experiment that we did with interrupting powers earlier. I mean, what we did learn from interrupting powers is that the player does kind of have an association with the latest thing that they're doing. But the problem, if you remember from the interrupting powers, is you didn't want to interrupt what you're currently doing. So if you combine those ideas, then you want to do the latest thing, but you don't want to interrupt what's currently happening. Just queue it up within a reasonable time frame for the future. And this worked great. That's what we wound up shipping with. We had the primary and secondary animation powers. We had the command queuing with a lot of rules. You know, in general, we want to prioritize the most likely skill. What that means is like the skill that we think the user was actually trying to do. There's still some edge cases, mostly around movement powers like Whirlwind and Vault, where there's some client-server synchronization to try and really tighten up those controls, and we're still working on those. But overall, most of the other commands feel really good in the player's hands. What did we learn? Well, good controls are really hard to do. And this has been my experience on almost every game that I've worked on. If you're going to have really good controls, you know, there's going to be a lot of edge cases and a lot of special rules. In general, the rule you want to think about is what did the player intend to do? A lot of times I'm talking to our gameplay programmers and we're having this discussion and we'll say, hey, you know what, we should try, you know, especially if you think about those command queuing rules, there's a lot of special case rules in there. And they'll say, hey, Wyatt, like, why is this so complicated? I thought that like design values simplicity. Why is it so complicated? And you know, the realization we had is that designs are have to be simple from the user's point of view, because that's the part that they see. And sometimes you have a lot of complexity under the hood in order to present something simple to the user. And an example that I would put forth is like voice recognition. You know, voice recognition is super complicated under the hood, but the whole point is to present the simplest possible interface to the user.